superpowers, specialist skills that help animals succeed in the toughest of environments. There's a group of insect jet setters, a tiny amphibian so tough it can cheat death. But our first weird event takes us to Zambia and to the South Luangwa National Park, where the star attraction is undoubtedly the African elephant. This charismatic animal is a must-see for all of the visitors. But this is the largest land mammal, and it doesn't take kindly to invasion of its private space. So imagine the shock when in 2009, a luxurious safari lodge received some surprise visitors. Staff and guests scattered as a herd of elephants sauntered straight through the reception and out into the central courtyard, only stopping for a quick nose around the gift shop. What had brought these normally elusive animals straight through the lodge without a reservation? Elephant specialist Dr. Kate Evans was surprised to hear about the elephant's sudden appearance. These are normally creatures of habit.
Anywhere you go in Africa, you'll often see these animal paths through the bush. Elephants do like to stay on these paths. It's obviously the route of least resistance, been worn away over thousands of years.
These paths guide the elephants to favourite food and water spots.
The older individuals that have been around for 50, 60 years potentially would have learnt from their mothers a long, long time ago that this is the route that we need to travel to get to water in time of need. And so the youngsters over time will pick up this information.
And it's this collective memory that keeps the elephants coming back to the same waterholes year after year, generation after generation. So if elephant movement is predictable, why the impromptu check-in at the lodge? Well, that's just it. You see, for this elephant herd, it was the lodge, not themselves, that was the surprise arrival.
I believe that they built the lodge on old elephant migration paths, and the migration path went through the middle of the lodge, and that's why they're choosing to go there rather than around.
With a memory stretching back this far, it can be hard to adjust when suddenly things change. So what do you do when a lodge springs up right in the way of the route to your favourite mango tree? You go straight through it, of course, stairs and all. And now, the elephants have become seasoned guests.
It would appear that these elephants have somehow learned that they're not threatened here, and this small group of elephants have chosen to carry on with their migration route and go straight through the lodge. But the elephant kept trying to go across and eventually got to the other side. Discussion started amongst the community, and they realised that they were following their old migration routes to get from A to B.
Collective memory is essential to the survival of elephants. It's been proven that in times of drought, an older member of the herd will lead that herd to a waterhole that hasn't been visited for years, perhaps decades. And this is why poaching is so devastating. It's not only about the loss of the animal, it's about the loss of its knowledge, of its memories. And this is why elephants as a species have a very healthy respect for their elders. So the largest land mammal has a suitably super memory. But our next group of extreme jet setters prove that when it comes to superpowers, size isn't every brutal place for a butterfly. Richard Fox has spent years studying the intricacies of butterfly behaviour.
Basically, it's too cold in the winter time across most of the United States and certainly in Canada for these butterflies to survive. So they've got to move or die.
The monarchs are quite literally flying for their lives away from the cold north. But to reach these warm winter hideouts, well, that's a seriously long-haul flight. These butterflies cover over 2,000 miles and fly for anything up to 10 weeks to reach these winter roosts. It's the kind of journey usually undertaken by birds or great herds of mammals. So how does a tiny insect manage it? Well, these are butterflies with superpowers.
We tend to think of butterflies as delicate creatures blown around by the wind, but these monarchs are serious flying machines. They have a brain the size of a pinhead, and yet they're able to navigate across a continent, and they can fly at very high altitude. Indeed, people have seen them from aeroplane windows.
And they're not flying blind. Monarchs come equipped with some serious inbuilt GPS.
So they have a time-compensated sun compass. In their brains, they have a compass which uses sunshine as a way of working out north and south. And in their antennae, their feelers, they have a clock which enables them to take account for the passage of the sun across the sky.
As they travel further south, these millions of monarchs from all over the United States are funneled together by the Gulf Coast and the Rocky Mountains.
In a good year, it might be 150 million monarchs.
And rather than spread throughout the forest, they huddle close together, warmth in numbers against the cooler nights. But as the sun rises and the day heats up, the butterflies leave the branches in an orange explosion. Not surprisingly, these winter roosts have become tourist hotspots. And for the people that live in these special areas, the arrival of the monarchs is cause for celebration. Laurie Mannell is the director of the Museum of Natural History in Pacific Grove, California. Also known as Butterfly Town, USA.
Pacific Grove takes its monarchs very seriously. The first Saturday of October of every year, all the school children in Pacific Grove gather together to welcome the monarchs back to the town. The butterflies are the cultural icon of this town.
But just how they find the exact spot that their family member travelled to the year before is still not fully understood. Nor is why they choose these particular stands of trees. When it comes to these extraordinary migrators, there are still more superpowers left to be discovered. That monarch migration is truly remarkable. But did you know that you can witness a similarly Herculean butterfly effort here in the UK? You see, painted ladies like these move from Africa up through Europe every summer and end up in our gardens, and we used to think that they just died here. Recently, however, we've spotted them flying back to Africa. So when you take in all of the generations, that's a round trip of more than 9,000 miles. Not bad for an insect that weighs less than a gram. Those butterflies are super migrators. But what do you do if you can't escape the cold? Let's travel to Canada, where we find an amphibian with an incredible survival strategy. Winters in the furthest reaches of the Northern Hemisphere are seriously tough. Only the hardiest animals can see through a season of warmer climes, but the frog can't do either. And being cold-blooded and fundamentally rather wet, you'd think that when winter came, the frog would freeze. And you'd be right. It freezes solid. an ice block with no heartbeat or measurable brain activity. For all intents and purposes, it's dead. But this frog has a secret superpower. Come the spring, it will come back to life. So, a Frankenstein frog that freezes solid in the winter only to come back to life in the spring. How on earth could this be possible? For almost any other cold-blooded creature, the cold is a killer. Their core temperature mimics that of their surroundings, and if this falls too low, the water inside their blood will freeze, forming ice crystals, daggers that tear cells and tissue apart. Some cold-blooded animals have emergency survival methods. Take the red-sided garter snake, for example. It produces a natural antifreeze that can protect its major organs for several hours at a time. It's a lifesaver if it gets caught out in the cold. But the wood frog needs to survive freezing temperatures for months at a time. When the winter comes, it must meet it head on. As the first ice crystals begin to form on the frog's damp skin, its core temperature plummets. But it's at this life or death moment that the frog does something very clever. Firstly, its liver goes into overdrive, producing masses of glucose, a type of sugar which it pumps into its cells to act as a type of antifreeze. At the same time, it releases a protein which attaches to the water molecules between those cells so that when they freeze, the ice crystals are too small to do any damage. Up to 65% of the frog's body is now ice, and its heart flatlines. For most other animals, it's a superpower. Clearly an amazing adaptation which allows this frog to survive in extreme environments. Now, we like to complain about the cold, and well, we should, because extreme cold can be very dangerous to us humans. You see, our tissue lacks the frog's glucose-producing properties. So when we get frostbite, the cells in our tissue freeze and then die and then rot. A very good reason to always remember your gloves. These stories reveal the extraordinary lengths that animals will go to survive. Whether it's an elephant with food on the brain, a sub-zero frog frozen solid, or a monarch butterfly collecting some serious air miles. It just goes to show that sometimes it takes superpowers to succeed. Although these stories have proved that what's on the inside really does count, having a superpower is not the only way to survive. Our next set of stories show that the ability to create a superstructure can be just as crucial and just as weird. From an oozing slime clogging fishing nets, to the mystery of elaborate works of art appearing on the seabed. But first, to the heart of Pakistan, where during the summer of 2010, reports of devastating floods spread throughout the world's media.
Tens of thousands of people are being forced to leave their homes.
Today brought new flood warnings in the southern Sindh province.
But from amongst all these news reports emerged an altogether different set of images. Russell Watkins from the Department for International Development was travelling to Sindh province when he came across a scene so surreal it stopped him in his tracks.
Nothing really prepared us for what we saw when we got there. What we were confronted with was quite spectacular. Every tree that you could see, every piece of vegetation that you could see for miles and miles on end was just cloaked in these enormous webs. The trees just looked like they were wrapped in candy floss. It was, very, very surreal, quite spooky in a way.
Russell had the photographic evidence, but not the explanation. So who or what had turned these trees in a remote corner of Pakistan into giant spooky cocoons? Silk specialist Chris Holland thinks he has the answer.
Whilst these trees completely covered in silk may seem really unusual to the vast majority of us, there's actually a very simple natural process occurring here.
For Chris, there's only one culprit capable of spinning these sinister structures: spiders. Just as the human population was forced from their homes by rising waters, so arachnid refugees were pushed back to the only dry land in sight.
It just happens to be that when you have flooding events, they have very few places to go, and they usually go for high ground, and in this case it would be the trees. So the types of spiders that you see in these trees are most likely the sheet web building spiders. These are the spiders that you would tend to find in the back of your garden, under your shed, or in your kitchen cupboards.
But these were big enough to entomb your entire kitchen. Just how had these webs got so vast? Ironically, the answer lay in the very water that had trapped the spiders. A stagnant breeding ground for mosquitoes.
So when you get a few spiders confined to this really small space, but a lot of food around, for example mosquitoes from these floodwaters, you suddenly would generate a huge population explosion where all these spiders are having babies. These spiderlings are running amok around these trees, creating lots and lots of sheet webs, which creates this huge, beautiful coverings of silk as we see in these photos.
So what Russell saw in Pakistan was really just normal spider behaviour pushed to extremes. And as it turned out, it wasn't the only example. In March 2012, thousands of spiders escaped floods in Wagga Wagga, Australia, covering farmland in a creepy, crawly shroud. And what you're seeing in these photographs aren't actually webs, but millions of strands of dragline. That's the silk that spiders lay as their safety net, and it's one of the most remarkable fibres in the natural world.
So spider silk isn't actually stored already reeled up like a fire hose inside the spider. It's actually stored as a gel, and this gel is made up of proteins. And as these proteins are pulled, they align into a hard, solid fibre. And it's the alignment and how these proteins go together as building blocks that gives silk its amazing properties.
This protein reshuffle creates one of the toughest fibres on the planet, a natural material so strong it can outperform steel. It saved the spiders from floodwater, and now scientists are working on ways in which it might save the lives of humans too.
If we really understand how spider silk is spun and processed, we may be able to reprocess it into types of shapes and structures that we can use inside the body. For example, making artificial bone, cartilage, or even trying to regenerate our nerves.
Silk could act as a kind of scaffold on which new nerve cells can grow, bridging damage. So the concept of a Spider-Man might not be so comic after all, but whilst this is exciting new science, as usual, we're lagging a long way behind nature. Birds, for instance, have been using spider silk for millennia, and one species that you might know of that does is the very pretty little long-tailed tit. It uses spider silk to make its fabulous little nest. What a thing. In the case of these spiders, the ability to spin their own safety line proved to be a lifesaver. But our next superstructure has a much more poetic purpose. We're travelling to the waters off Japan, where in September 2012, underwater photographer Yoji Okata spotted something remarkable. An intricate circular pattern carved into the sand. a peaked ring of ridges and waves, perfectly executed. In 50 years of diving, Yoji had never seen anything like it. But was this a scientific discovery or some sort of underwater hoax? Yoji began a stakeout, hoping to unmask the culprit, who turned out to be more sub-aqua than extraterrestrial. The artist responsible is a pufferfish. Yoji saw a male work tirelessly, sculpting and perfecting his pattern over a number of days. And no one in the scientific community had ever seen anything like it. Biologists like Dan DaCosta were blown away by its behaviour.
Pufferfish are not well known for swimming fast or moving fast at all. And the way this pufferfish is moving and moving his fins to make this nest is just out of this world.
But why does the pufferfish go to all of this effort? Well, the circle acts as a kind of oceanic love token. The female is drawn into the patterns and she lays her eggs in the central depression, where they're protected from currents.
There's fish that do things to attract females, but not a single tiny fish like that builds a huge nest just to attract the female. And they say little pieces of corals and pieces of shells in it just to make it more attractive. That's quite unique, it's incredible.
Talk about a grand, romantic gesture. Even though scientists have discovered more than 120 different types of pufferfish in both tropical and fresh water, they've never seen anything like that sculpturing ever before. When you think about it, more than 70% of our planet's surface is covered in water, much of it little explored. So there must be many more phenomenal things out there to be discovered. Whilst the pufferfish nest is a work of art, not all superstructures are quite so appealing. This next strange substance is unlikely to win any popularity contests. There's a very sticky situation facing fishermen in the Atlantic.
So how do you get rid of all that slime?
They're pulling up their nets and pots only to find them covered in slime.
So does it ruin your prawns?
An oceanic ooze is clogging their nets and having to be bailed from boats.
Oh.
Armfuls of this colourless gloop is appearing in any one catch. With often more slime than fish, removing it from a haul is an absolute nightmare. Now, it's too common a complaint to be attributed to some freak event or rare natural phenomena. Something is creating enough of this substance to drive fishermen crazy. The question is, what? Well, the source of this mystery mucus can be found on the deep sea floor. The repugnant perpetrator is the hagfish. It's the undertaker of the deep, searching the murky bed for corpses. It uses a rasping tongue to pull flesh from bone. It will even wriggle inside a rotting corpse to devour the soft flesh under the skin, literally eating the victim inside out. But nasty eating habits aside, the question remains, why would a creature that lives on the seabed need to produce slime? Well, aside from its willingness to eat seafloor scraps, the hagfish doesn't seem to have very much going for it. It's pretty much blind, has no jaws or tough scales. It looks vulnerable. But in fact, the hagfish really is quite a success story. It's been around for a whopping 300 million years, which makes it one of the oldest fishes in the sea. And the secret to its success is slime. It's a defensive strategy so brilliant that it makes the hagfish quite literally untouchable. Professor Doug Fudge studies these master slimers.
So the hagfish is essentially covered with slime glands, and when an animal is attacked by a predator, there's muscle in the area where it's touched that cause those slime glands to release their contents. There's actually a little mini volcano of slime that comes out of the gland. It's reinforced with tens of thousands of silk-like protein fibers that we call slime threads, and it mixes with seawater, and it forms this large volume of very unusual fiber-reinforced slime.
A single hagfish can turn a bucket of water into slime in seconds.
Ew, that is so gross.
Which proves to be a pretty fantastic underwater weapon.
In a recent study that was published by a group in New Zealand, they showed hagfish using their slime in a wild situation.
The fibrous mucus is designed to choke a predator by clogging up its airways. The shark is left gagging as its gills fill with mucus. Every assailant is repulsed by a wall of slime. And the technique is so effective that the hagfish seems utterly unperturbed by the assault. So both predators and unsuspecting fishermen are getting the same treatment. But how does the hagfish prevent itself from becoming the victim of its own slimy strategy?
They have an ingenious way of getting out of the slime. They'll tie their body in an overhand knot, and then they'll pass their body through the knot, and that will wipe the slime off of their body.
A necessary skill for the ocean's most slippery character. Now, you may not like this, but humans produce slime too, in the form of snot. And what's remarkable is that hagfish slime and human snot are actually composed of very similar proteins. Now, hagfish use their slime to protect themselves from predators, and humans use their snot to trap harmful substances and then expel them from the body. So, when you think about it, both hagfish and humans are using slime as a frontline defense. These animals have proved that in the natural world, it pays to be a master craftsman. Whether you're a silk spinner escaping the rising tide, a slime producer defending yourself from attack, or a sand sculptor looking for love, a superstructure is crucial to success. So, a specialist skill can help an animal get ahead. But what if you just can't survive on your own? Rather than admit defeat, this next selection of weirdness shows that enlisting some help can hold the key. There's a strange subterranean structure created by remarkable teamwork. But first, a chilling tale of some real-life zombies. Eric Williams from Delaware was mopping his kitchen floor when a dead beetle began to mutate in front of his eyes. Only one to witness this miniature horror.
No idea what those things are. I see all these strange hairs moving around.
What do you think that is?
It's a cockroach.
No, look at the string just coming out of it.
Oh my god.
All of these records had that one thing in common, be it a mopped floor or nearby puddle. The presence of water was triggering these writhing worms.
That's disgusting.
But what were they? And how had they got into the bodies of these insects? Biologist Janice Moore has spent her lifetime fascinated by this particular weird event.
Whenever I was a child, I used to see these long worms sort of squiggling around my grandfather's horse trough. And I was told they were horsehair worms, and that is their common name because legend has it that these worms come from horsehairs. Well, in reality, they're parasites, and they're parasites of crickets, grasshoppers, that sort of animal. These parasites live inside, say, the cricket, and grow up to be huge compared to the cricket, all coiled up. The cricket is almost total parasite.
The hairworm larva develops snug inside the host insect's body. But to complete the life cycle, it has to breed. And to do this, it needs to find water. And rather than leave the safety of the host, the hairworm has no qualms with making the poor insect do all of the legwork. This fiendish parasite alters the host's behavior.
So at that point, the cricket becomes almost suicidally attracted to water. And they've been reported to jump into toilets, into dog watering bowls.
And if the hairworm's big enough, the merest hint of moisture can be enough to tempt it out.
What is it? I've never seen anything like that before.
Keep an eye out for these miniature body snatchers, because they're found here in the UK too. In fact, in every corner of the globe, super sneaky parasite species have found ways to get others to do the hard work for them. For example, the mind controller that lurks in German gardens.
So there's a really fun parasite. The scientific name is Leucochloridium, and it actually lives in the intestinal tract of a variety of songbirds.
The parasitic flatworm reaches maturity inside the digestive system of the bird and casts out its eggs in the bird's droppings. This would be the end of the cycle for Leucochloridium if it weren't for the garden snail that finds bird droppings irresistible.
When they eat these eggs, the egg hatches, and the little larval parasite, a flatworm called a trematode, moves into the tentacles of the snail. And there it grows up into a kind of a striped mass.
The snail's tentacle is now one enormous, pulsating flatworm brood sac. But here, our parasitic mastermind encounters a problem. Just like the hairworm, it can't breed in the snail. To lay its eggs, it once again needs to be back inside a bird's intestinal tract. So how does the fickle flatworm complete the cycle? Mind control. It forces the usually reclusive snail upward toward the light. Once exposed, the snail's tentacle is a pulsating grub on a plate.
Birds will look at this and say, aha, good to eat, and they'll eat it. And in that way, the life cycle is complete.
Now, the poor snail is the middleman. It might just get out alive minus a tentacle. But other hosts are not so lucky. Our next parasite requires its host to make the ultimate sacrifice.
So one of the most spectacular examples of zombie behavior is that of ants infected with a fungus.
If you're battling for space in the rainforest, hitching a ride on the back of an ant would seem to be a clever tactic. But it's not nearly clever enough.
I've walked around the neighborhood and eating a lot of apples, and it's fermenting in the stomach, you know.
The elk was accused of being under the influence. And why was that? Well, getting stuck in an apple tree was a bit of a giveaway.
Very red eyes, you know. It looks drunk.
When the inebriated animal had tried to reach for more, it had slipped and got itself wedged into the tree. The story of a boozy moose was perfect front-page fodder. But what's the truth behind this headline? Could eating fermented fruit make a wild animal drunk enough to get itself into such a compromising position? Well, fruit is a fantastic source of energy for animals because it's full of sugars. But when yeast, which are found on the skins of these fruits, react with all of the sugar, fermentation occurs and alcohol is produced. Professor Robert Dudley from Berkeley University studies the surprising relationship between animals and alcohol.
Alcohol is a reliable indicator of the presence of sugar. And fruit-eating animals, they need to find sugar, and if they don't eat over several days, they die. It's life or death. And if alcohol molecules alert them to the presence of sugars, they can find it faster and consume it faster, then they don't have to deal with the competition.
So if alcohol is found in most fruits and nectar, then why aren't we seeing drunk animals everywhere?
They're not drinking liquid alcohol, they're eating fruit, which also happens to contain alcohol. So as they consume more alcohol, they're actually filling their gut with carbohydrates and lipids and all kinds of structural things associated with fruit. So they get full. They probably get full before they can get drunk.
So without hitting the bottle, it would be difficult for an animal to become drunk on naturally occurring alcohol. But it can happen. In the United States in 2007, necropsies carried out on some cedar waxwings found high levels of alcohol in their blood. These birds had gorged themselves on so much food that it had begun to ferment inside their bodies.
The birds were legally drunk according to state law, so there are actually a few cases of documented sort of death by ethanol and true drunkenness in the animal kingdom.
If the apples in that Swedish garden had been fermenting for long enough, then they could have produced enough alcohol for the unsuspecting elk to feel the effects. And its behaviour had all of the hallmarks of drunkenness. Once stuck in the tree, the elk wasn't coming down quietly. It was time to call in reinforcements. Urban Bongram from the fire department assessed the scene.
We decided to use our winch at the front of the truck, and we tied a big rope round the tree, and so we pulled it down.
The tree was nearly 90 degrees, you know, and when the moose fell down, pop, and just lay down. Ooh, pull up the head and look at us. It looks very tired and looks maybe a little bit hangover.
Whilst its exploits became big news, the unfortunate elk had no choice but to sleep off the escapade. And a few days later, left the village none the worse for wear, although presumably it was off the apples for a while. Well, it's certainly a fun story, but sadly, because no tests were ever done, we can't be sure that the apples were to blame. And of course, you can't breathalyse an elk. But there has been another report recently of more drunken birds, this one much closer to home, and one that's also been proved. A set of blackbirds were picked up in Cumbria in November 2012, and the post-mortem result showed some typical signs. A belly full of berries and a high blood alcohol level. And what we think happened was, it was winter. There was a shortage of food, so they gorged on the fermenting berries, with no idea of the potential side effects. Then they were killed in mid-air collisions, just going to prove that you shouldn't drink and fly. In the case of these birds, fermenting berries proved deadly. But what if alcohol in your diet is unavoidable? Our next story takes us to the rainforests of Malaysia, where we find two little mammals who are serious binge drinkers.
So one of the really interesting examples of alcohol exposure came out by German researchers working in Malaysia, and they described the slow loris, as well as hen-tailed tree shrews. And these animals drink fermenting nectar all night from a certain kind of palm tree. So the flowers produce copious nectar, and it then ferments in the warm, humid, tropical environment. And the animals come in and lap it up all night.
Scientists studied these tiny mammals consuming the equivalent of beer-strength alcohol for hours on end every night. And this wasn't accidental. These animals were actively seeking alcohol. But if the side effects of alcohol can be deadly, then why would wild animals choose such a potentially dangerous food source? Well, that's just it. Despite the nightly binge, the scientists could find no obvious signs of drunkenness, no strange behaviour, no dangerous side effects. So they tested hair samples, which confirmed that these animals had indeed been consuming alcohol long term. In fact, the results drew a surprising parallel.
There is a biochemical marker for alcoholism in modern humans. It's called ethylglucuronide, and it turns up in hair samples of alcoholics. Otherwise, nobody exhibits this molecule, except for the pen-tailed tree shrew and the slow loris, and none of the other mammals in the rainforest have this marker.
So their genetics confirmed that they were definitely consuming alcohol, but showed no signs of getting drunk. So what's their secret? Well, their bodies have evolved to process alcohol much more efficiently than our own, which means that they can make the most of the calorie-rich nectar without any drunken side effects. So the tree shrew could drink you under the table and never get a hangover. Whether you're an unfortunate elk, a boozy blackbird, or a sozzled cedar waxwing, the desire to fill your belly can have some very dangerous side effects. Unless, of course, you're lucky enough to be a tree shrew. So there we are. We've delved into a catalogue of the most fun, the most foul, the most morbid and marvellous stories that our planet has to offer. And whether it's been bizarre animal behaviour or weird natural phenomena, it's had the very best of our brains completely baffled. But then, given the natural world's ability to astound, this only really leaves us with one final and inevitable question. What next?
Next, giving in all too easily to temptation, how the escapades of Queen Victoria's two eldest sons failed her. In one of history's most unusual love stories, Judi Dench portrays Victoria in Mrs.